Hello everyone and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today's webinar focuses on the various steps that fall into the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD bracket. Here's a sneak preview.
So I like working on climate change, and I like working on it in companies which have big emissions footprints. So I guess you could say I like a challenge. The TCFD recommends disclosures across 4 key areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Pick up BHP's latest TCFD report that was released on the 10th of September and say, this is a great example of a TCFD report. To be fair, it's a great report, but there are lots of other reports out there. Get started, have a go. Take it slowly, bite it off in manageable chunks. There's no shame in stealing other people's templates for this work. So feel free to take BHP's and do whatever you would like to it.
Climate change is happening and companies have now introduced multiple ways to mitigate their carbon footprint. However, changing climate-related issues such as severe weather patterns and rising sea levels can also have a financial impact on your company. This webinar dives deep into the multiple steps so that you can be fully prepared for these threats and opportunities. Thinkstep-anz CEO Barbara Nebel and sustainability consultant Christin Schaller are today's hosts, and they speak to BHP's Vice President of Sustainability and Climate Change, Fiona Wild. Fiona is also a member of TCFD, and it was very interesting listening to her speak about how BHP, a company involved in a sector which possesses a high carbon footprint, is addressing these issues. With that, let's get started.
Hello and welcome everyone to another session of our webinar series Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 minutes. Our topic today is TCFD, Improving Resilience with Good Reporting. We'll explain the acronym TCFD a few times throughout the webinar, so don't worry about that. I've got 2 experts with me today. We have Fiona Wild. She's Vice President of Sustainability and Climate Change at BHP, but also a member of the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Reporting Disclosure. And I also have my colleague Christin Schaller here. Christin is looking after many of our carbon-related projects and will set the scene for us around improving resilience with TCFD. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Christin to set the scene, and then afterwards Fiona will share some of her vast experience all related to TCFD with you. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion at the end.
Thanks for the introduction and hello everybody. So as Barbara mentioned, I would like to give a really brief overview on our topic today. In classic ESG reporting, we are measuring the impacts of companies on climate. Today, we want to have a slightly different perspective and want to look on the impacts that climate and climate change have on companies, and in particular, their financial impacts. So there are 3 different types of financial impacts. The first one is physical risks, for example, extreme weather events, that can have direct impacts on a company through, for example, impacting a production site, let's say. Then there are also transition risks, which are covering all impacts and risks that are related to the transition to a lower carbon economy. For example, an increase in carbon price is one of the transition risks and will especially impact carbon-intensive businesses. So those 2 risks are related to costs, but there are also opportunities, especially for companies that are making efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. An example for opportunities could be, for example, if a company develops innovative and low carbon technologies and solutions. So it really is important for a company to see which of those financial impacts that are related to climate change actually are relevant for them. While it is really important for companies to know and understand them and also integrate them into their strategies, it also is really important for investors to know which of those financial impacts a company are actually facing and how well prepared they are. So this is really where TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, comes in. The task force developed a recommendation framework helps companies to report on their climate risks and opportunities, which is important for the investors, as I said, but also TCFD provides a couple of guidance and information for companies to integrate those risks and opportunities into their business. The TCFD recommendations are a voluntary framework, so not really a strict standard. They consist of 11 recommendations that are grouped together in 4 core elements, which are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And those core elements should really sound familiar as they're part of most company structures. And that shows that TCFD really doesn't want to reinvent the wheel. It wants to build on existing structures when it comes to integrating climate risks and opportunities into your company. It also shows that it can be a little bit challenging, because those 4 core elements are not sitting within one department in a company. Cross-functional collaboration is required to make TCFD reporting happening. So there's another thing that I really want to share with you, which is that the last month was a real TCFD month. The task force reported the status report and provided additionally information for companies to help them to get started, and also reported on the progress that is happening in the field. We will link to those 2 documents, and 3 documents are actually. And another important and exciting event happened in October, which was the TCFD Summit. For the 2nd time, Japan held this summit, and speakers from all over the world shared their experiences with TCFD, also their challenges. And one presentation stood out, and that was the presentation from Fiona. And she shared her insights about why it is important to get started with TCFD reporting. So I'm really excited that we have Fiona with us today, and I'm really looking forward that she shares her insights with us today. So thank you, Fiona, and over to you.
Thanks very much to Barbara and Christine, and apologies if you can hear background noise from my home here in Melbourne. I have someone digging up the gas main outside my house, which is always excellent timing. So a bit of background to me. I started out life as a climate scientist about 25 years ago. Then I moved to work for BP, the big oil and gas company, for about 12 years on climate policy and environmental issues, and then have spent the last 10 years at BHP, which is the world's largest diversified mining company. So I like working on climate change, and I like working on it in companies which have big emissions footprints. So I guess you could say I like a challenge. I've also been a member of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, since it started back in 2015. Christine provided a great overview of the TCFD, so I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of BHP, as I'll talk through both TCFD and BHP's response to it in my comments. So BHP produces copper, nickel, metallurgical coal and iron ore, all of which are integral to supporting a low carbon transition through decarbonisation and electrification. And we've been taking action on climate change for decades. And our approach has evolved from, like many companies, reporting operational emissions back in the 1990s to where we are today with a much more comprehensive strategy that addresses a whole range of those physical and transition risks. A few examples of what we're doing. We have a target to reduce our operational emissions by 30% by 2030 and a goal for net zero operational emissions by 2050. And our emissions footprint is about 15 million tonnes. We've developed a pathway to get to net zero, and we expect to spend around $100 to $200 million per year on projects to support decarbonisation out to 2030. We've also set goals to support decarbonisation in our value chain, or Scope 3 emissions, particularly from the steel and the maritime sectors. And just this week, we announced a $50 million partnership with China Baowu, one of the largest steel makers on the planet, to address emissions from integrated steel making. 10% of our executive remuneration is directly linked to achievement of these operational and value chain targets. And we use a range of scenario analysis to test our company strategy against different climate futures, from a 1.5 degree outcome all the way through to a more than 3 degree outcome. So you can see a whole range of activities underway to address a comprehensive range of climate related risks and opportunities. We started aligning our disclosures with the TCFD back in 2017. I guess one of the downsides of being a member of the TCFD is I feel like there is then a responsibility to align your company's reporting with its recommendations. So we've been doing that in our financial filings since 2017, and our last report was released on the 10th of September, our climate change report. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that if you're interested in learning a bit more about what a TCFD report can look like. So I'm going to talk for about another 10 minutes, and I'm going to cover two key questions. Number one, how does a company get started on reporting and disclosing in line with the TCFD's recommendations? And number two, how can we quantify climate-related risks? So on the first question, around reporting and disclosing in line with the TCFD's recommendations, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that disclosure is a process, and it's okay to take a few tentative steps before you have a perfectly formed disclosure platform or you have the answers to every single question. So it doesn't have to be perfect to be disclosed. As Christine noted, the TCFD recommends disclosures across 4 key areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And to be honest, some of these are probably more straightforward than the others. So when you're starting off, one thing you might want to do is start with a gap analysis. You could say, let's compare our current disclosures to the TCFD's recommended disclosures to determine gaps. And then you can disclose your intent to align your reporting with the TCFD. Then over the next couple of years, you might decide to prioritize the areas where most people find it's simpler to start, and that's governance and risk management. So for example, you might assign oversight to board committees and management as needed. You might implement new processes for information and data collection to address the gaps that you've identified. You might start to incorporate climate-related risks into your risk management processes and assessment processes. And then you would move towards disclosing information related to governance and risk management recommendations in your financial filings. And bear in mind that the TCFD encourages disclosure around governance and risk management regardless of materiality, because we think investors are really interested in these two elements of recommended disclosures. Next up, you might want to tackle the things which are seen to be more challenging. First of all, you might want to identify some metrics that might be useful for assessing your climate-related risks and opportunities and targets to improve performance. Then you might want to identify relevant climate-related scenarios and think about how those scenarios might affect your company. And then once you have those two elements in place, you might start to disclose information related to strategy and metrics and targets recommendations where they're material, because we do have a materiality threshold around strategy and metrics and targets. One thing I would just note is that scenario analysis and the recommendations on that particular topic is consistently found to be the area of the TCFD's recommendations where levels of disclosure are lowest. Again, as I talked about with general disclosure, it's important here to think about you can start simple. You don't have to build a quantitative macroeconomic model to meet the expectations of the TCFD. When I think about scenario analysis in its purest form, I think it requires companies to ask themselves a series of questions. Number one, what are the assumptions that underpin your company strategy? Number two, could any of these assumptions be impacted by climate change? Number three, if so, how and how much? Is it likely to have a positive or a negative impact? Is it likely to be big or small? Number four, how would you know if this impact was starting to happen? Are there signals you could track, signposts you could look for? And number five, if you saw them, what would you do? To support companies in their scenario analysis, as Christine mentioned, the TCFD has just released a report on scenario analysis for non-financial companies. And it's really designed as guidance to assist companies who are interested in using climate-related scenarios to help implement the task force's recommendations. It's meant to be practical, process-orientated information, and also provide ideas for disclosing resilience of strategies under different climate-related scenarios. And you can find this guidance on the TCFD website at fsb-tcfd.org, and we'll share that after the webinar. So that's the answer to question one. How does a company get started on reporting and disclosing in line with the TCFD recommendations? My answer is take it slowly, bite off manageable chunks, make qualitative assessments ahead of quantitative assessments, and importantly, check in with your investors to see if what you're providing helps inform their decision making. Question 2, how do we quantify climate-related risks? And here I'll talk a little bit about how we think about this at BHP. Risk management is a really integral part of BHP's governance. So the board, sustainability committee, risk and audit committee, and senior management are regularly provided with insights on trends and exposures to climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as performance against risk appetite. So this board oversight is really key, given the scale and the pace of climate change. As Christine pointed out, there are 2 general groups of climate-related risks that we think about. Transition risks, which occur from the transition to a low-carbon future that relates to policy, regulation, technology, market, and other types societal responses to climate change. And we think about those as part of our strategy discussions, portfolio reviews, and investment decisions. And then there's also physical risks, and these include the acute risks from, for example, increased severity of extreme weather events, but also chronic risks from longer-term changes in climate patterns like sea level rise. When we assess physical risks, we include consideration of the potential vulnerabilities of our operated assets around the world, but also our investments, portfolio, communities, ecosystems, suppliers, and customers across our value chains, because obviously the impacts of climate change don't stop at the boundary of your operations. The other thing to bear in mind is that climate change isn't just a single standalone risk. It's very unlikely that in your risk profile you would have one entry that says climate change. This is because climate change is a really complex and pervasive risk, and in a sense it acts as an amplifier to others, or a volume knob is sometimes the way I think about it. So for example, a greater risk of extreme weather increases both the likelihood and potential impact of risks to the integrity of BHP's assets, and also impacts on supply to market. The other thing to bear in mind is that climate risks manifest themselves across a whole range of different areas. What that means is that ownership and control of those risks sits across a range of operational and functional areas within your company. And so you can't think about climate change as an issue which is for the sustainability function alone, because the controls may not be within that team's grasp. So a fully functioning approach to climate risk management has to be company-wide. It's also important to note, as Christine did, that this isn't just about identifying risks. There are also opportunities to be identified. So for example, for BHP, opportunities around resource efficiency, cost savings, and building resilience along our supply chain to support business continuity. So although primarily companies go into this thinking about risks, make sure you also think about what the opportunities might be that are available. Finally, as with TCFD implementation, it is totally okay to take a transitioned approach to climate risk identification and management. If you're not sure of the risks to which you're exposed, start with those that you're most confident about. If you're not sure of the materiality, start with ranges or directional insights. Look for information from peers and see what you can learn from them. What do they think is material? Is it likely it's also material for you? And again, test with your investors to understand where they see material risks and opportunities for your business. As Christine mentioned, the TCFD has just released a report on integrating climate-related risks into risk management processes. And this guidance is specifically aimed at companies that are interested in integrating climate-related risks into their existing processes and disclosing more information on how those processes align with the task force's recommendations. Interestingly, there are 5 takeaways that are identified in that report. First one is a common understanding before beginning efforts to integrate climate-related risks into existing processes. It's really useful to make sure there's a basic level of understanding across the company of climate change concepts and potential impacts. The second thing is around interconnections, like we've talked about. Integrating climate-related risks into existing risk management requires analysis and collaboration across the company. This means all relevant functions, departments, and experts are involved in the company's risk management processes and in the ongoing management of those climate-related risks. Timing. So climate-related physical and transition risks need to be considered across short, medium, and long-term time horizons to be helpful for operational and strategic planning. And that might mean thinking about things on a slightly longer time frame than normal. The fourth thing they recommend is around proportionality. So the integration of climate-related risks into existing management processes should be proportionate in the context of the company's other risks. So don't build a separate standalone system. Look at climate in relation to the other risks that you're managing. Use the same type of way of quantifying those risks so you get a sense of proportionality across your full risk profile. And then fifthly, consistency. As I mentioned, the methodology you should use to integrate climate-related risks should be consistent with your risk management processes for all other risks across the organisation. And again, this guidance on integrating climate into risk management processes can be found at the TCFD website on fsb-tcfd.org. So in summary, get started, have a go, take it slowly, bite it off in manageable chunks, make qualitative assessments ahead of quantitative assessments, and importantly, check in with your investors to see if what you're doing is useful. On risk, build that understanding of the key issues, the key risks and impacts from climate change. Take a whole of company view on climate-related risks and opportunities. Think short, medium, and long term, and embed climate-related risk assessment into your existing risk management processes where you can. I think the success of the task force's recommendations is going to be measured not by encouraging people that already do a really good job to do an even better job, but by encouraging companies who haven't thought about doing this before to take the first step. Because if you can lift the standards of disclosure for the majority of companies, we actually get to see, understand, and manage climate risks and deliver those opportunities more effectively. So I'll stop there and open up to questions.
Thank you so much, Fiona. There was so much practical tips in there, and I really like your recommendation of just get stuck in and don't overcomplicate it. And that was really one of the key takeaway messages when I heard you back then at the TCFD Summit as well. So really good practical advice. What I'd be quite keen to know also is, where is our audience at? So let's just ask our audience, where on the TCFD journey are you? Have you already done full climate risk assessment and TCFD disclosure? You just started the journey. Your risk register already covers climate change at a high level, which is a good starting point, or you haven't done anything yet, which is fine, because you can start with those practical tips. So at the moment, there is just one who's done a full climate risk assessment. It might be Fiona, or it might be someone else in the audience. And otherwise, it's a relatively even split. A lot of them have started the journey, and a lot of them already cover climate change on a high level. So that's really encouraging. I think you're all ready to go to the next step, follow some of the advice that Fiona has shared. So thank you for that. And we have also, for those of you who have started, what are your key drivers? Is it your investors asking? Is the board asking? Is it compliance? Or do you just think it's good practice and we should be doing it? Which is a really good reason as well. Let's just see. Investors. Investors seem to be the main ones driving it, followed by, we think it's just good practice. We think it's just good practice. I mean, isn't that great to have an audience who just think they really need to do the right thing? Thanks, dear audience, for sharing your thoughts on that. And now keep your questions coming. Now here's one. Any recommendations for combining TCFD reporting with integrated reporting framework for not-for-profit organizations? Interesting.
I don't know enough about the not-for-profit sector because I work for a very large corporate, so I would say I'm not going to be able to provide a specific answer to that one. I think one of the things I've learned working for BHP is that we originally used to do a lot of our climate reporting outside of our main financial filings. So we would have, for example, a sustainability report that would go into a lot of detail about how we address climate change. And what the TCFD has enabled us to do is to take that information and actually embed it into our annual report. So when you talk about integrating reporting, what we're trying to do now is really have our annual report and our financial filings as the main source of information for all of our climate-related information. The reason we do that is because, first of all, climate is a material risk, so obviously should be covered as part of the annual report and the financial filings. The second thing is because the main audience for this is now the mainstream investor. So where this used to be seen 5 years ago as perhaps a bit of a fringe issue, perhaps an issue for those kind of boutique ESG advisory firms, it's really not anymore. So this is a mainstream investor ask, and that means the best place to put this information is in your financial filings, because that's where they go. The third thing I would say is when you put this information into your financial filings in an integrated way, what that does is it means that this information has to be subject to the same level of rigor as all the other information that goes into your annual reporting. And that's really good because it raises the profile of this issue. It means your CFO becomes much more closely involved with the information that you're reporting externally. And so it actually makes climate a mainstream financial topic. So my view is integrate as much as you possibly can, because not only does it demonstrate the criticality of managing climate risks inside your organization, but it also demonstrates it to your stakeholders that you think of this as a core material risk for the company and you're managing it appropriately.
I think that also included one of the comments that Christine made earlier. It's about cross-functional collaboration. It really is involving and bringing together the risks of finance and the sustainability teams all together. We have a few more questions. One is from Julia asking, should the climate risk disclosure be audited or have some sort of assurance?
And a great question. And really, this is kind of, at the moment, this is up to individual companies to decide. So at BHP, we do subject our climate-related disclosures to assurance. So we have limited assurance over our qualitative disclosures, and then we have reasonable assurance over all of our climate-related data. And we've been doing that for a long time. So we've made that decision. Obviously, when you also put that data and information into the annual report, you would expect it to be subject to the same level of rigor as all of the rest of the content in the annual report. In terms of the TCFD itself, as Christine mentioned, it is a voluntary framework. But what we're also starting to see is that some jurisdictions, particularly in the EU, are thinking about introducing this as a mandatory requirement. Some countries, for example, France, have introduced a mandatory requirement about reporting in line with the TCFD. And so often that will encourage companies to start thinking about assurance as well. From my perspective, although going through the assurance process is always painful, I think there is something really valuable to be able to say to others that a third party has reviewed this information and believes that it is accurate and balanced. Because sometimes people can start to tell great stories about what they're doing, but it doesn't necessarily also pick up where things aren't working so well or provide that real balance on the challenges, the risks, and the opportunities. So I would encourage considering assurance, because I think it does make it makes the processes more rigorous and makes sure that you're telling a much more balanced story. But at the moment, it isn't a requirement through TCFD.
And questions are coming in. So Paul is asking, can you please provide some examples of the details of TCFD guidance, especially where it may be different to traditional financial reporting?
What I would send you to, on the TCFD website, fsb-tcfd.org, there's actually something called the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which has masses and masses and masses of examples of disclosures from a whole range of different companies in both non-financial and financial sectors. So that the beauty, I suppose, of the TCFD recommendations is that they are meant to be broadly applicable, whether you work in the financial sector or not, whether you're in the energy sector like I work, or whether you're working in, fast-moving consumer goods. So there's loads of examples there where people can go. The status report that's also just been released that Christine mentioned also has some examples of good examples of disclosure. And also those guidance documents that have just been released have examples as well. So I'd really encourage you to go to that Knowledge Hub on the TCFD website and pull out some of those examples, because it's one of the easiest ways to get started. There's no shame in stealing other people's templates for this work. So feel free to take BHP's and do whatever you would like to it. But just getting started, and sometimes using a template is an easier way to do that.
Thank you. That's a really good encouragement. And well, I guess it's why reinvent the wheel, right? If there are good examples out there. So what we will do is we will send links to the Knowledge Hub. We will also send a link to your report. and have one specific question for you, Fiona. What do you see as the next steps for reporting at BHP on your ESG journey?
That's a great question. It never really stops. I think that one of the problems I have is people say to me, well, we've done this, so is this the end? I'm like, no, it's not the end. So I think one of the challenges we're facing at the moment is around how we set targets and how we report progress on addressing emissions outside of our operational control. So I mentioned before, we're doing a lot of work around value chain emissions. So the emissions that come from our customers processing and use of our products, like, for example, blast furnaces in China. It's really hard to know how we can ensure that those customers are going to take action to reduce their emissions, but we know we need to work in partnership with them to encourage that activity. And so being able to demonstrate that we're serious about catalyzing that action and how we can report progress on those goals that we set is going to be quite challenging for us. So I think that's probably one of the most challenging areas, is working through how do you encourage action where you don't control the activities, the plants, the operations that are actually giving rise to the emissions. What's the role of a company like ours in encouraging sectoral decarbonisation? So for us, that's one of the most sort of difficult issues we're grappling with, but we're up for the challenge always.
Yeah, I did think your comment that your Scope 3 emissions include the actual steel making was a really interesting one as well. There is one question now on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, specifically around Goal 13. Well, if I would have to answer the question, how would you tie that in? I would pick up on your last comment and say, it's about this one here. It's not just Goal 13, but it's also Goal 17, collaboration, because you really cannot only focus on one of the goals, but need to look at all of them, and particularly picking up on your last comment, Fiona, collaboration along the supply chain is really important.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think we can't think about climate in terms of it's an environmental issue or it's just an energy issue. It's much, much more pervasive. And, you know, Christine was right talking about that range of risks to which we're exposed. Physical transition risks, these things permeate across all sectors of the economy, all countries around the world. So there is going to have to be that acknowledgement that no matter what you do, no matter where you live, we're going to have to start thinking about addressing this topic, and collaboration is absolutely key, not least of all because the scale of the challenge is so great.
One is probably the hardest question. In your opinion, what is the best public TCFD report out there at the moment?
That's not a hard question at all. That's a super easy question. You know exactly what I'm going to say. I'm going to pick
and we will
on 1 second
that report as well.
I'm going to pick up BHP's latest TCFD report that was released on the 10th of September and say this is a great example of a TCFD report. To be fair, it's a great report, but there are lots of other reports out there. As I say, the TCFD Knowledge Hub has loads and loads and loads of reports you can go to. This is our latest version. We've done a couple of these before, but you see people are adapting and evolving their approaches all the time. And that's the message, I think. There isn't a kind of gold standard. This is really just about saying, have a go, keep testing it with your investors, ask them what else they're expecting you to do, share with them where you're having difficulties, because that's also really helpful, and just have a go at it. And beg, borrow and steal from peers in your sector just to see if there's opportunities to leapfrog ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Fiona. And yeah, let's just get stuck into it. What we will close it now. What I'd like to tell you, though, is that we have a couple more TCFD webinars planned for February, which seems a long way away, but we do have Christmas and the summer break coming very soon. And we will have the Climate Disclosure Standards Board talking to us also about how to get started, possibly slightly different angle, and then also how to improve your TCFD reporting for those who are already further on the track. We have a few other webinars as well. As always, check out our website, follow us on LinkedIn. Thanks again very much to Fiona and to Christine for setting the scene.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.